In this video, we're going to be thinking about how using traditional elements is quite a handy thing when you're writing a serial piece. And I'm going to use a kind of ridiculous example, if you like, to make this point. Now, if you've got familiar elements in the design, we've talked about this before, haven't we, about you might want to use something that's quite triadic in the design of a row. So even though the row's never going to be tonal, it could have some tonal references. So that's one example of how you might use some traditional parts of our conventional Western musical thinking, if you like, when you're composing a serial piece. We've talked about other things like talking about textures and colour and so on. We talked about how things other than the pitch can be very traditional in their design. But here's one specific idea I just want to put to you in this video, not as the be all and end all of writing a serial piece, but it's just an idea to think about. And it is this notion of using traditional rhythmic values inside a row. Some people, when they're writing a serial piece, are sort of thinking, well, we've got to do something that's a bit more radical. So I'll organize some really complex rhythms that, perhaps difficult to play, but actually give their piece a completely different character that's trying to pull away from more conventional routes. But what happens if we absolutely root ourselves in convention and do something that's very straightforward rhythmically? And I want to show how that in a way can work very well in serial composition. So here's a particular exercise, taking something that is very familiar. So being a Brit, I'm going to use our national anthem. Okay, so God Save Our Gracious King goes like this. Okay, now what happens if I decide to write a row that uses exactly the same rhythm as that opening statement of the national anthem, and at the same time also uses the same melodic outline? Now, it doesn't have to map the intervals, it can't map the intervals, otherwise it won't be serial. There may be moments of divergence, but it's still basically following the same shape. But we organise a row that's following the shape of that opening part of our national anthem and is following the rhythm. Now, the first thing you've got is two notes too many. So you'll notice what I've done here is to organise the first 12 notes of what I've played a moment ago as a row. And then for the last two notes, as I've just got two additional notes, I've just started the next statement, which will be the first two notes of a retrograde statement at the same pitch. This is a way of finishing it off, and then obviously it would continue. But you'll notice as well that I'm keeping the first four notes as they are. So we've got some pitch familiarity as well. You'll notice in the second bar, the second measure, we've got these three rising notes. So I've got three rising notes here. Then you'll notice in the next bar, I've managed to keep the notes the same there. You'll notice as we cross the bar line in the original, it goes down, and I've had to go up just to accommodate all the notes of the row. It's the sort of manipulation you sometimes have to make. But then where I've got three descending notes there, I've got three descending notes here. There's just a step up over the bar line. I've had to include a wider leap to get through all the notes of the chromatic scale in the row. And then this notion of coming down, here I am coming down. So you see, I've preserved the melodic shape as much as I can, and I've used exactly the same rhythm. Now, this is kind of going to an extreme on this basis, isn't it? But you can soon hear how in the context of a row, having that kind of traditional shape and the same rhythm actually breeds a kind of familiarity that might work quite well. Well, see what you think. Have a listen to my serial version of those opening statements of the national anthem with those extra 2 notes on the end. It's funny, isn't it? Because as soon as you hear that, you have to look at it and think, well, yeah, actually, we've got all 12 notes of the chromatic scale organized as a row. I've used a little bit of repetition because the original piece just happens to use repeated notes there. And I've managed to get a little bit of copied repetition in the end, so it flows on to the next statement and connects with the statement we've got. But exactly the same rhythm, the same shape. You almost hear it as the national anthem, even though it's now totally serial. Listen to the two put alongside each other. Here's the original. Here it comes serial. Now, of course, at one level, this is a bit ridiculous, isn't it? Because would you really want to say, oh, well, let's take a famous tune and do this to it? Well, you could do. It's quite an interesting exercise, and one that I'd encourage you to do, actually. And we have got an exercise in doing this because I think it actually kind of makes this point very well. But the bigger, more serious point is this whole thing about traditional melodic shapes, traditional rhythmic values, certain patterns that are very familiar to us that could be the design of a row, absolutely connects this with the tradition. So again, it's pulling us away, I think, healthily from this notion that when Schoenberg came along and got us into serialism, he was making some absolutely radical departure with anything that had gone before. I've never believed that to be the case. As I said earlier in this course, it seems to me to be entirely logical what he did. Whether you like serialism or not is another matter, but it's entirely logical that you go from a world that's become so chromatic that the breakdown of tonality has come about. We have to organize things in a different way. That was Schoenberg's response to it. But actually, isn't it interesting how even though that was true of pitch, if you decide you're not going to become a total serialist and start serializing other elements, all these other elements can be used in a very traditional, conventional way. So rhythmic values, melodic shape, what happens when we unashamedly use them and build them into our design and use of a row in a serial piece? I think it's a very useful exercise to think about in order to really sharpen our minds in actually what are we using that belongs to the tradition alongside the serial approach. And I think you might find the exercise in this to be of some value in that regard.